This talk is using two case examples of how to increase species conservation and biodiversity using freshwater and coastal systems. Now, to do a preamble for a minute as to the background theory to this approach. Geology in its full expression of large-scale features such as folds and faults, and the small-scale features such as rock types, minerals and hydrology is the basis of geodiversity. And from these geological underpinnings derive a large variety of landscapes, soils and water regimes in different terrains from mountains to plains, from inland to coast, and in different climates from humid to arid, tropical to boreal, that form the basis for habitats for vegetation and fauna. And from this perspective, logic, geodiversity is the basis of biodiversity. Thus, in simple terms, geology is the basis of geodiversity, which in turn is the basis of biodiversity. Perturbations and destruction of geology and consequent loss of geodiversity results in a loss of habitat diversity and biodiversity. And conversely, recognition there is a link between biodiversity and geodiversity will lead to better understanding of environmental management and consequently an increase in the conservation success of species that currently are underrepresented or not represented in the conservation estates. At management level, consideration needs to be given to the understanding of geology at all scales, and the geomorphic and hydrological and other geological processes that maintain ecosystems at all scales. This is because the habitat variability related to rock types, geochemistry, hydrology and all the other aspects of geology like hydrochemistry leads to various expressions in vegetation structure, vegetation floristic composition, population maintenance strategies and phenology. Clearly, gross changes in geology lead to gross changes in the vegetation and floristics. That's clear. But subtle changes in geology, such as in soils and water, can lead to subtle changes in vegetation and floristics. And this is what we'll be focusing on, that looking at the subtle changes that are occurring in the habitat can lead to changes in vegetation and floristics and therefore a loss in biodiversity. So we're going to maintain biodiversity and conserve biodiversity. We'll be looking at the subtle changes, the small-scale changes, the small-scale phenomena that are occurring in an area. The focus here on coastal wetlands like mangroves and freshwater ecosystem, we're using basin wetlands, will make the case that the full richness and expression of biodiversity as vegetation structures and floristics and vegetation as secondary habitats for fauna is diminished by impacts on geology and geodiversity at all scales, reflecting the scales that vegetation and floristics are expressed. This is an example of a basin wetland where the Ramsar site, where there's a biodiversity in the basin and it's related to the subtle geodiversity of the area. The Betcher wetlands or Ramsar site, we're going to go through the setting, the sediments, the hydrology, hydrochemistry, the plant assemblages that occurred there, the vegetation history, because it gives us an idea of what's happened in the past naturally, and the wetland evolution. I've got 10 minutes. The setting. In southwestern Australia, this is a double cuspate foreland. Cuspate foreland. And in this area, the southern cuspate foreland, a series of wetlands located here as the black regions that occur across that cuspate foreland. That cuspate foreland ranges in age from 5,000 years to the present. That line through there is the old Quaternary shoreline, and this cuspate foreland began growing about 5,000 years ago and accreted out to the present coast over the time, and therefore it's younging to the west, and it means that that was the shore 5,000 years ago. This is the shore 4,000 years ago, this is the shore 3,000 years ago, and the wetlands did not exist here when the coast was where I'm showing the line now. So that the wetlands are being inserted on terrain that's going younger and younger is going west. This is an example of what's taking place, the first parts of it. This is beach ridge complex prograding to the west into the sea, and as it's growing and growing, the water table that's under the terrain is rising due to its being, for a given location, its distance from the sea. Today, this is the water table across the coastal plain. 5,000 years ago, that was the water table. And the water table at a given site rises as the coast progrades, which means that wetlands are being created in the terrain as the water table rises into the terrain. This is an example of a wetlands cross-section. Its complexity in terms of sedimentary fill. Once it becomes a wetland, it fills with carbonate mud because of carra that grows there. Carra, a plant that when it dies disintegrates into carbonate mud. And during humid times, the deposition of peat. And the complex stratigraphy is a result of the history of filling. This is a simple, relatively simple basin that's filled up with sediments, and it shows the complications that are occurring on the margins. Another one, and in this case, complications generated in the stratigraphy, or the sills if you like, is that as the wetland becomes acidic, it starts to dissolve at its base the calcareous sediments that are host or underlie the wetland basin. And that line there is the contact between the beach sediments and the dune sediments. That's the same line there. And it's dropped down here because of subsidence due to solution. I'm illustrating here the complications that are occurring. The end result with, yeah, okay, that's fine. The history of these wetlands, a given basin, is summarised here. It involves carbonate filling, peat filling, later during arid times, peat ignition and combustion, which produces cliffs and internal discontinuities, and the sinking of the base of the wetland as carbonate is dissolved by the acidic groundwaters. That is a history of an average basin in time, and it shows wetland expansion, enlargement, contraction, expansion, enlargement, and sheet washing from the margins, and a very complex internal structure which is going to have an effect on the vegetation.
Don't close it.
Don't close it. I'll continue talking.
No, it's
Oh, sorry. I'll do without the notes. All right. Here is an record of the hydrology of these wetland basins using a mud basin versus a sandfield basin, and looking at monthly sampling over here was 11 years. We've since continued that up to 25 years, but the story here is that looking at the monthly records between the years for this wetland versus that wetland, one sees a longer term pattern, and so that when there are changes that are occurring, they're having an effect on vegetation, and one can separate out in this particular area, which is largely, 5 minutes to go, a natural system, and so understanding of this natural hydrological response to variation in rainfall results in vegetation changes. That's just basically saying we have, I won't go through it in detail because I haven't got much time left, the complex hydrochemistry that's in the wetlands related to whether it's peat dominated or carbonate dominated, and summarised here in the way the processes are operating with the, for say, the metals that are present. I lost them. I got it, okay. and how they're going to affect plants. This is the diversity of plant life that occurs in the wetlands, looking at the major species, and there are a few species that are confined to the wetlands, and small-scale difference, depth of water table, and distribution related to water levels, poor water chemistry, metallic content, and so forth, and that results in vegetation complexes across the system as shown here. The important component of the study was looking at the pollen record because it showed the hydrochemistry changing over time created these vegetation changes. Here are different assemblages over time related to the 4,000, 2,500, 3,500, 3,000, 2,500, 2,000 year intervals and how the biota changed. If you're not aware of this, changes in the biota today can be misinterpreted as being something that's, say, anthropogenically driven. Now, coming back to this overall diagram, that is the basis for looking at wetlands that are young. A few current ones are forming, and these are old ones that are formed 5,000, 4,000 years ago. Now, at that age, they've gone through a maturing process, whereas these ones are just starting. And in that context, there is a young type of wetland that has just become a wetland with the water table rise, to this type of wetland where it's starting to perturbate groundwater, changing the chemistry of the wetland basin, to more complicated hydrology as the wetland matures and becomes filled with sediment, to ending up with the complex wetland which has got solution at the base, perturbation of water, infill that's complicated, and then the vegetation responding. Now, the last few slides shows the principles of what we've just gone through, but now in a coastal setting in where there is mangroves on the northwest of Western Australia, major area in the northern part which is tropical and humid, decreasing to the south, a typical embayment which is composed of these geomorphic units, spits, tidal flats, alluvial fans, colluvial soils on the margin, and the mangrove zonation or diversity that responds. Typical view of a mangrove in this region, zoned mangroves. Another typical view of mangroves. Here, spits with the mangroves between and bordering it, and alluvial fans that come from the hinterland and develop mangrove habitats or niches at the mouth of the rivers. Now, that's that diagram again, just to give a context. This is the type of complication that occurs in these mangrove areas where we've got hinterland types, colluvial soils, the tidal flat, cheniers, and alluvial fans, fresh water coming down the creeks, fresh water discharging into the colluvial soils, and this complicated system results in complicated mangrove zonation. And in here, the last diagram showing that process, or those processes, and the resulting zonation of mangroves across the tidal flat, along the spits, and up where I've got the marker now, that'd be alluvial fans. This is the result of the complicated, small-scale effects that are occurring, which is basically, in principle, the same what we saw with the basin wetlands. So, for both freshwater wetlands and coastal wetlands, it is information on the understanding of and the interaction between the small-scale habitat features of the geomorphology, the substrate types and soil development, the stratigraphy, the hydrology, the hydrochemistry, and from the point of view, say, looking at the history of pollen, the natural temporal changes in biota in response to changes in the physical and chemical environment and climate. These, I believe, are what we believe are going to be addressed in managing, preserving the biodiversity of an area. Thank you.
Thank you very much.